Hey there, everybody. It's MPA here, Michael Adams. You just heard my voice, and now look, I'm on screen. Isn't technology amazing? So today we have Mr. Andrew Scheps, and he's going to be on screen with me in a minute. We're going to be going through a mix session. As I said, this is Waves Open Sessions. Now, please, if you have any friends who are in the comments section or are texting you saying, I can't see this, please just remind them that the best browsers for this kind of experience are usually Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, or Firefox. Safari generally has a few problems, and also Internet Explorer has some problems. So without further ado, please, let's get me off screen, and let's please welcome Mr. Andrew Scheps. Andrew, how are you?
Hello, I'm good. How are you, Michael?
I am amazing. So thank you very much for doing this. Before we go on, I just wanted to kind of like get a quick elevator pitch from you on the Scheps story. So let's talk about, how long have you been doing this, and what can you tell us about you? Because obviously there are going to be some people who want to know a bit more.
Good God. Well, the first thing is that the self-isolation has not changed my hair or beard routine whatsoever. So that's good. It's something to know about me. I haven't had a haircut or trimmed my beard in 15 years. So that's good. I've been doing this, I guess, 30 years now. I graduated from college in '88, and I worked for a manufacturer. I worked for Synclavier for a couple of years and then went freelance in 1990. So yeah, that's 30 years of just doing this. And obviously, I started off as an assistant. I did a lot of editing and synth programming and kind of anything I could get my hands on, and then worked my way up into more engineering. But I'd always, not always, but since I discovered that studios were a thing, I'd wanted to be an engineer and then a producer since probably, I don't know, seventh grade or something like that. No one in my family did it. My parents are both English teachers. So, there's no grew up going to studios or even knew much about it. So it's all from reading Mix Magazine. And then I went to University of Miami and studied recording for 4 years. It's a great program down there. And there were some amazing people, too. So a really good group, including Joe Barresi and Neil Avron. And there are so many people I was at school with who are out there making records. John Paterno, and I've been friends with him for 30 years, which is amazing. Well, 35, which is even scarier.
You're actually, and recently you made a move, didn't you? You moved out of the US and you moved into it's Worcestershire, right? Aren't you in Worcestershire,
Yes,
in the UK?
it's where they make the sauce. Yes. We are at Punkerpad UK as opposed to Punkerpad West. Basically, any room that I put my tannoys in is Punkerpad something. So yeah, Punkerpad UK out in the West Midlands, where it's gorgeous. It's a little chilly today, but it's going to be warming up for the next week. And I if you're going to have to stay home, I really can't complain. I got a beautiful house. I got a garden. I can get outside. So I feel really, really lucky to not be in a city at the moment.
Yeah.
It's working out.
Yeah, it's like I think most people would agree with that right now. It's like,
And there's a local brewery that delivers. So that's it.
there you go.
That's the main thing.
Winning. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about, obviously, is the fact that you used to be surrounded by a ton of analog gear, but now you mix completely in the box.
I do.
And obviously, mixing in the box you can do absolutely anywhere. You're doing it in a room of your cottage in Worcestershire. So how about we just move straight to a session? So boom. With technology, I'm now looking at your Pro Tools session, and
You are.
do you just want to tell us a bit about this session that we're going to be using today, and talking about the artist, and give them a bit of a plug and give us a bit of a story on it before we go into it?
Yeah. Well, the song is called Sound the Alarm, and it's a band called Holloway. They're an LA-based band, really great musicians, four-piece rock band. And they approached me. They had just done demos. They wanted to see if I would be interested in mixing their record. And they sent the rough mixes to my manager, and I loved them, and we worked it out. So it was something that was, it's not a label project. They tracked it themselves. And it was the first time they'd recorded themselves as a band. And they did a really good job, but mostly, I mean, the writing and the arrangements is really, really great. And then I ended up actually putting it out on my label. So I don't know that that really did them much of a service. It hasn't done much, but most records don't do much. But it's a really cool record. It came out, it's got to be 5 or 6 years ago now. But the reason I decided to use it is because it's a relatively simple session. It has the drums actually cut. What do they call it? I can't remember what they call it, but the cymbals are cut separately from the rest of the kit. And what that means is we've got a lot of separation, so I can open stuff up, and it's sort of easy that way. Then there's the single bass, but it's just split between sections. I don't know if they did that thinking I would want it that way, but they cut it all in one piece, or if they did it separately while they tracked. I'm not really sure. Then some guitars, not a huge amount. Open up these rhythm guitars. So not a ton of stuff there. Then a few little keyboards just on this one sound effect transition. And then we got some vocals. So it's a really simple session. I mean, it's not 8 tracks, but it's not 100 tracks.
Right.
I've been mixing something recently where I was at, I think, 230 tracks for a 20-minute jam. That's not a session I want to try and navigate while we're doing stuff. So really, I mean, I wasn't even going to break apart the whole mix. What's good about it, though, is there's something here to answer any question anybody asks, basically. And that's why I thought this would be a really good session to do, because it's not one of the things when you're working with stuff that's more programmed or you've got more synths or things like that, is nobody really knows, well, what was that sound to begin with, because it's not a standard thing. Whereas these are all pretty standard acoustic drums, guitars, then the bass and the vocals. So it should hopefully be good source material just to show you what stuff does and what I do.
Let's have a listen quickly, and then we can go through some of your plugins and explain some stuff to some people.
All right. Well, I'll start at the top. I'm not going to play the whole song, but it takes a while to get to the chorus. Which I don't mind, but
we don't mind.
Don't bore us. Get to the chorus.
We're here with you.
I'll take you through like the first verse-ish thing, and then we'll start breaking stuff down.
Okay. It gets louder in a second, guys.
So it goes something like that, basically. And then it gets rocking, and there's a chorus, and there's a guitar solo, and, it's a great, great band. I'd highly recommend checking out the record. It's very cool.
It's a great driving track. I mean, this is what I refer to as a speeding ticket. So, all right, so let's go through. Where do you want to start? Let's talk about some plugins, Andrew. What are you using in here? So where do you want to
I don't know. I mean, because this session is old enough, and I actually prepped it for NAMM like forever ago. So it's actually got a bunch of the Scheps 73 from when that first came out. But I've taken sort of all the stuff I love about the 73 and then all the stuff I love about a million other things and put it into the Omni channel. So there's Omni channel everywhere on this. I mean, what we should do, let's start with the drums, because I think it's just a good place to start. So I'll just go through and mute my VCAs real quick so I can do soloing and not worry about getting the rest of the track going. That took a second. So the drums, like I said, they're cut. So if I take these cymbal mics and mute them, you're going to hear it's basically just kick, snare, toms here. And then this is all just cymbals. So I'm not actually a huge fan of cutting drums like this. I think people see that Queens of the Stone Age do this because Josh really likes to have control over the cymbals. But to me, there's just groove stuff that is very, very difficult. They did a really good job on this, but it does tend to balance a little strangely. But for our purposes, it means I don't have to deal with any hi-hat bleed in the snare mic because he wasn't playing the hi-hat when they recorded the snare. So that's the upside of it. So if you can get a good feeling take, that's great. There was something. Oh yeah, okay. Let's just dive right in. So the kick drum, there's a kick in and a kick out. So, and what I've got is just really standard EQ on kick in, no high pass filter at all. I'm pushing some 60 hertz, pushing a little bit of 7.2 and then a little bit of shelf. So here we can just hear what that is doing. Little bit of a happy face EQ, and it kind of gives that low end a bit of a push, which is good. And I am using the preamp, but not with any extra gain. So there's a little bit of harmonic distortion going on here, but not a ton because the levels are relatively conservative. And then I've got pretty much the same. I probably dragged it down to the other kick mic and so you can hear it just drops the kick an octave. It just brings out the fundamental a little bit. So that was done years ago before NAMM when we saw each other in Anaheim. And then when I opened up the session a week ago, I thought, well, all right, now I'm going to use Omnichannel all over it. So, wow, apparently I did a ton of stuff on this. I don't remember specifically what I did on anything, but let's see what's going on because, man, there's a bunch of crazy stuff going on here. I've got a gate going on this guy because there's a lot of snare bleed. You can hear it's almost like a slap on the kick when that gate isn't in. So this just tightens it up a little bit. I'm using the saturation and the thump in the preamp section. So the saturation, it's in heavy mode, so it's a clipper, as opposed to odd or even harmonic distortion. It's actually a clipper. It's a two-stage clipper, and it's got a really, not unique, but it's got a different sort of knee to it than a lot of clippers have, and it's something I really like. So I can play you without the saturation here. So you can hear it actually sucks some of the low end out, but it gives it a real presence and it starts to push it forward. And then the thump is going to be adding some of that low end back in. So this is a really, really broad EQ down around 100 hertz. So this is with the thump. I mean, and in isolation right now, I'm thinking, no, maybe I like it better without the preamp, but whatever. In context, I liked it better with, otherwise it wouldn't be there. Then you've heard the gate. The de-esser, so this is interesting. I almost never use this de-esser to de-ess because sibilance is amazing. The original Waves de-esser is great. Like there's so many great de-essers that I don't reach for this when I'm going to de-ess something. And the reason there are two of them is because while we were designing the plugin, I said, I really want full frequency range de-essers. I want that type of circuit, but I don't want to be limited to mid-range and sibilance. I want to be able to go 20 to 20K. And there was some question about, well, would that be good? And I said, I don't know because there isn't one, but I would like there to be one. So let's check it out. And it turns out it's absolutely genius. So I'm cutting out, it looks like 116 hertz, and this is a threshold for it. So what I'm going to do is I'll play you with and without the de-esser, but then I'm going to show you how I set that frequency. So you can hear that's all the sort of mess that's in the lower mids to the upper lows. And the way I find this frequency is I don't know that 116 is some magic frequency. If you hold down the control key, when you move any control in the plugin that is frequency based, it turns the plugin into a bandpass filter and you can actually listen to the frequency. So in this case, I was sweeping for that kind of knocky thing that I wanted to get rid of. So you can hear that's up above the fundamental, but it's ringing kind of long. So now I can just dial in this threshold to suck out as much of it as I want. And again, out of context, who knows? But that's the idea behind the de-esser. So I use it on kick drums, on floor toms, on acoustic guitars all the time to tame the boom. Because sometimes you don't want a static EQ like that, especially when you're dealing with something that's more resonant. Because what'll happen is that frequency range will actually be really nice for a while until a certain thing happens. Like on the floor tom, until the kick drum gets hit, the floor tom ringing is actually really nice down there. But when the kick hits, now you've got bleed into the floor tom mic, or the other way around, floor tom bleed into the kick mic. So to have a dynamic way to take care of that stuff, or the boom on an acoustic guitar, something like that, you only want to deal with it when it's very resonant, but leave it alone. So a simple EQ really isn't going to cut it. And once you get into multiband compressors for that sort of thing, you're starting to get into phase shift, which can give you extra delay if you're going to try and use a linear phase crossover version. And there's so many reasons why to be able to just suck out some frequencies like this makes a lot of sense to me. There's a lot of times I'll use this on acoustic guitar where I'll use one band to suck out that boom like I was talking about, but then I'll use, there are 4 different filter shapes for this, and I'll use the really tight filter up around 3.5, 4K to get rid of just the sound of the pick on the strings. Because sometimes if an acoustic is being layered in with a bunch of electric guitars or piano or full frequency range stuff, you can be left with just the sound of the pick, and it's almost like a percussion instrument. You don't get the notes. I don't have an example of that in this session, unfortunately, but you can just go in and find the bit that's going click, click, click and turn that down a little bit. And it just helps you turn the guitar up without it turning into a click fest.
So before we go on, one of the things obviously that people are seeing about this plugin is that it's incredibly powerful. How is this on a normal computer's CPU?
It's actually not too bad. One of the reasons is because we made sure that it was going to be zero latency because we wanted live guys to be able to use it. So among other things, that gets rid of the possibility of using some stuff that could be more CPU intensive, like look ahead on the limiter. The limiter has no look ahead on it. So it's not going to be a mastering limiter. It's a smash the crap out of it or just keep the red lights off limiter. But because there won't be a big look ahead, therefore there won't be delay as you go through the limiter. The other thing is, if I instantiate one from scratch, here, I'll just put one on here because why not? When I put this in, nothing is actually enabled. So the only CPU load there is the meters, which is, I mean, you know, I don't know, you could get 500 million meter plugins on a modern computer. You'd be fine. Like there's nothing going on there. So what happens is as you touch the controls, you notice the gate just turned on because I touched the threshold. So there's none of that weird gotcha where you're turning knobs. You're like, oh, that sounds so much better. And oh, right, it's not in. As soon as you touch a knob, it comes in unless you've explicitly turned it back off. But it only engages the bits that you engage, and the rest of it is actually off. So it's pretty low CPU. To be honest, I've never run into an issue with it. Like I use a plugin on my mix bus that will be the same as 300 of these channel strips. I'm sure if you had all the modules in across 120 tracks, it would register, but it's not that bad. I've never heard somebody complain about it.
And the beautiful thing about obviously about this plugin as well is that this is pretty much, correct me if I'm wrong, your dream plugin when it comes to what you actually wanted. So you're using this. This is not a plugin that's just got your name on it. This is something that you're using in your mixes all the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, the Scheps 73 was the attempt to just get a great 1073 because that's my favorite EQ. I'm a Neve kid and I love 1073s. And the idea of that one was rather than find some weird quirky 1073, I've got a BCM 10 back there with 10 of them in, and it was to find an average 1073. So to really give you the feel of it, but without necessarily too much color one way or the other. Parallel Particles was an attempt to give some of the more complicated workflow stuff that I do with parallel processing and give it to people who don't necessarily understand how to deal with delay compensation on 4 different sends to 4 different parallel processes, 2 of which are feeding other parallel processes. Like it's a really, really complicated signal path inside that plugin. So it was a way to package it and let you pop it on an insert. But because I use all of the chains I've built myself parallel, that's not something I use all the time. Though I think I actually did use it on the on the rhythm guitars because it's just a great way to just make something sparkle a little more, to push it a little bit. And we can talk about that plugin. But the channel strip was, I am sick of having 4 or 5 plugins on channels and having to open up all of the windows to be able to quickly move between things. And I'd gotten to the point where, like, I would never put a compressor on an insert unless I was just going to be smashing the crap out of something to really affect the tone of it. I just wouldn't do it because I didn't want to take up the plugin slot. I didn't want to open up the window. Like, I'm EQing here, so I don't want to deal with compression. But with the channel strip, I am constantly just checking out, hey, well, what's a little bit of compression sound like? Ooh, what if I add a little more saturation to that? So I'm skipping around and using all of the different bits of the plugin all the time. So yes, I would say 99% of the time while I am mixing, when I insert something on a track, it is this plugin. It is always my starting point. There is either nothing or there's one of these, and then there might be something special, which is like, well, okay, this one doesn't do it. But even, I'm going to skip around to stuff because that's what we're going to do. There's also, sometimes you want to do something that plugin doesn't do, but you need some of what it does. So, like on these drums, I built a drum reverb for the choruses. So I'll just play a little bit of the chorus and then I'll mute it and you'll hear how dry the drums will get. So it's built to sound like a room, not like a big reverb on the drums. And in context, what it does is because the guitars get so much bigger, they suck all the air out of the drums. So in a way, the drums sound like nothing's happened. They just get a little bit beefier. But in the track, if I didn't do it, the drums would start to disappear and get really dry. So I knew I wanted to put a reverb on this, but I put it in the insert of a channel strip because I also knew with the drums, there's a lot of low end in the room that I love. And I don't want to get rid of that in the actual room tracks, but I don't want that going to the reverb. So I knew I was going to want to filter the drums coming into that. And then I also knew that I was going to need to take out some low mids after I had the reverb going because the reverb was going to be a bit boomy because it was going to be a dense room. So inside of this, in the insert, I've got an IR1 that's got Schnee Studios, which is a fantastic sounding live room. It's a room that's now part of Larrabee in LA. And just while we're on IR1, one of the great things about IR1 as an impulse response reverb is you have this decorrelation control, which all it does is make shit super wide. We can talk like that, right?
Totally, we can.
I don't know. It's a family show. And the family swears. So I love this decorrelation control. So you've just got control over the reverb time, which, that's not a unique thing. But this decorrelation is rather unique. And I'll and I don't know if you'll be able to hear necessarily the decorrelation with the drum kit in, but it really helps spread it out. I mean, I'm hearing it in my headphones fine, where you hear the low end start to push out to the sides. And that feels like what happens when you're driving a room. But because it's sitting inside of this, first of all, I can filter it beforehand. I can de-S it, which I'm actually de-booming it afterwards. And if I needed to take cymbals out, I could do that, take some sibilants out. But what it also means is if I build this and I really, really, really like it, I can just save it as a preset, either in the Waves presets or in the Pro Tools presets. And when I recall it, it not only recalls the channel strip, but it recalls the plugin that's in the insert and all of its parameters as well.
That's pretty powerful.
It's really good. And I do it a lot because you almost always want to treat stuff. And so I did the same thing here. Oh, no, I didn't actually. I just went for the distortion on the drums dirt. So this is just a distortion. So I'd already done some pre-processing and some post-processing with some EQ, and I just decided to go ahead and leave that. But again, I could have wrapped that inside of an omni-channel and just popped in the insert. And as you saw here, these modules don't always have to be in the same order. Like I moved the de-esser later because I was thinking, well, I might want to EQ, but then I would suck upper mids out if I needed to, which it turns out I didn't. But you can change where the insert is. So the order of these modules and the insert, you can change on every instance of the plugin.
So I have a question here from the comments that we can't see that are underneath this this live stream. Henry says, Your Omnichannel has become my favorite plugin. It's a great learning tool. Will you take a moment to talk about when you choose to EQ before or after you compress in the Omnichannel?
Yeah. Basically, when we first designed it, I'll call up one that doesn't have an insert just because it's a bit easier. And I think this is the standard order. When we designed it, originally it was going to have a pre-dynamic CQ and a post-dynamic CQ. But then we just decided it took up too much real estate and it could potentially take up too much CPU. So that's why the insert was born. So one of the choices in the insert, if you look at EQ, is SOC, which is Scheps Omnichannel EQ. So you can have two identical EQs in the channel strip and put them wherever you want. So the default order for me is generally the order I would work in. So I'm EQing before the compressor most of the time. Now, you could easily swap that and you can make the case for either one. If you're going to be doing drastic EQ to something, then I think you probably want to do it post compressor, because you're going to be pushing a lot of frequencies and that's going to push into the detector on the compressor and you're just going to compress more. So then you can't really just EQ, because every time you're changing your EQ, you're also changing the compression. It's a little bit harder to hear what's happening. So with drastic EQ, I'd put it after the compressor. And that's also why the high pass and low pass filter are in the preamp section, not the EQ. So if we decide to, it's not enabled, so it doesn't want to move. So if I decide that I'm going to EQ after the compressor, but I need to take care of some low end before the compressor, you still have filters before. So you don't have to use the insert just to get filters. So generally, I would always filter before, and I would usually EQ before, just because that's the kind of default and that's what I'm used to. But you can make a case for either one. I think that the biggest way to think about this processing is you need to learn what the things sound like enough to think about them like guitar pedals. Because a guitarist will think about, well, do they want to flange the reverb or reverb the flange? Those are two totally different effects. So if you flange before the reverb, it's a much more subtle flange, and then that flange gets spread out in the reverb. If you go to the reverb first, the flange has a ton of raw material to work on it. It ends up being a really deep but precise flange. And that's kind of an obvious thing. And so you need to start thinking about compression and EQ the same way. Do you want to compress the EQ'd signal, or do you want to EQ the compressed signal? And I would say generally, okay, to go back to the original design of the channel strip, the one that was going to be before the compressor was only going to cut. It was going to be called the surgical EQ, and it was only going to cut. The one after the compressor was going to be the musical EQ, and it was only going to boost. So that's kind of how I think about it. You fix your problems before you get into dynamics processing. Then once you're done with your dynamics, you have the kind of the shape and the tone, and now you're just dealing with the tone of that thing within the mix, and that's your musical EQ.
Jim just asked that exact question pretty much, which is compression after EQ, why compressing EQ seems counterintuitive, and I think you just answered that.
But it depends, because there are times when you need to EQ first because you need to turn it into the thing that needs to be compressed, or you need to fix what is wrong with it before it gets there. So you can easily make the argument for both. But with something like this, you can so quickly swap them that you should just check it out and see, because you'll probably just develop a preference. Because what will happen is it doesn't really matter what it sounds like to do it. It matters how you hear it and how you react to it. And you'll start to build in your head the idea that, wow, I really get my results faster when I'm EQing into the compressor. Well, great. There's no reason not to do it, and play with it both ways.
David has a question. He goes, is there a difference between the EQ section in the Omni channel and the Scheps 73?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there are two bands that are somewhat similar. The shelf here, this resonant high shelf, which is, oh, it's awesome. I love this thing. That is kind of Neve-ish. There's nothing in this plugin that is just taken from somewhere else. It's all tweaked, but there are things that are based on that. So this resonant high shelf is based on that. The one of these wide mid shelves, they're different. The mid and the tone, the wide and the peak are actually totally different. I can't remember which is which now. I think that this is the Neve one on the tone control, and the mid is actually really cool if it's the one I'm thinking of. Basically, it doesn't sound exactly like it, but it's based on the idea of the API 560, which is a graphic EQ, right?
Hmm.
And as you boost or cut more, the Q gets tighter. So if you boost 6 dB, all of a sudden you're into a pretty tight Q. So I found when I was using the hardware of those that I would almost always, if I was boosting more than 3 dB or so, I would always push the sliders above and below up about half as much and kind of draw myself a wide curve. But instead of being this nice smooth curve, it's actually kind of a stepped curve. And it's a cool sound. And so that's what one of these two wide bands is based on. And to be honest, I would have to go back through 1,000 emails to remember which is which. Or Mike, the project manager, probably remembers because he remembers everything.
He does
But that's
remember.
what that's what those two are based on. Every single band on this EQ, except for the parametric bands, which are meant to be very surgical and precise with no color whatsoever. They just do exactly what you tell them. The other two possibilities for each of these bands are all different, and they're all sort of either based on things or I made them up completely because it's something I've just always been looking for. Then the preamp, the kind of the structure of the odd and even harmonic distortion is Neve-ish, but only because I like Neve. So while we were balancing it, I ended up making it sound kind of Neve-y. But again, we didn't copy it.
So I have a question here. While we were talking, we were just on EQ, and where is it? Where is it? I lost it. There we go. Gabrielle. Hi, Gabrielle. So hi, Andrew. My question would be, how do you approach mid-side EQ? Specifically, any tips you have for mono compatibility?
Um, wow. Yeah, I don't really worry about mono compatibility too much. It's worth checking, but it's the balance is so crazily different. Like if you go back and listen to some big rock records from like the 90s, which have super wide guitars on them, listen to them in mono, and the guitars are just, they're missing, even though they're really loud when you listen in stereo. And it's not because they're out of phase, it's just because the balance doesn't necessarily work when collapsed down to mono. And if you listen, I mean, even Beatles records, which were put out in both formats at the time, those are very different balances for mono and for stereo. So I wouldn't worry about mono compatibility for MSEQ because you're not actually doing anything to the phase. It's just that you're EQing different stuff. So I've got an omnichannel on the mix itself. And I think one of the best things you can do when you want to learn about mid-side processing of anything is, let me see, I'll leave the vocals off and let me collapse these folders. And I'll just turn on the guitars and bass so we can hear stuff. In the monitor section of the Omnichannel, you can listen to just the sides or just the mono. So mono here is collapsing left and right into mono. So it's actually like a mono monitoring switch. This is mid and this is side. So let's have a listen. I'll go to the chorus. So it's pretty obvious stuff, right? In a mix like this, the kick, snare, and bass kind of go away when you listen to the sides. So the strategy, though, in terms of like when would I EQ MS, is really when I want to do something and I think, well, but if I do that all the way across the stereo spectrum, it's going to mess with something else. A really good example of that would be, well, something like these rhythm guitars. Now, I haven't EQ'd them MS, but I could. So let's solo up the rhythm guitars. I've got some EQ going. What am I doing? Am I adding any top? Half a dB of that high shelf. We're adding, okay, 3.4 at 1.4K. So that's this kind of frequency. So it's that real throaty thing. Again, I just held down the control key and clicked on the knob. It turns into a bandpass. So that's awesome for finding the frequency, especially with distorted guitars. But let's say that I was actually wanting to add a bunch of like 3K, 2.5 to 3K to this. That could start to fight with the vocal. but the vocal's in the middle. So what I could do is open this guy up, go to MS, and it's going to leave the settings there. So now this is essentially exactly the same EQ because I'm doing the same thing to the mid and the sides. But while I hit play, I can take down that mid-range boost in the mids. So now the balance frequency-wise hasn't really changed, but I've actually just cleared out some room in the middle of the mix that could make more room for vocal or snare or something like that. So rhythm guitars is a good place to think about it. Also piano, big stereo piano. Those things are huge. They have every single frequency. It's white noise, but only some frequencies at a time. But eventually it plays everything. So it will step on absolutely everything. So I will tend to add upper mids just on the sides, and I will suck low mids out of the middle on a piano because you'll never hear that in a mix. It won't sound unbalanced. There won't be any weird mono thing to it. But what it will do is it will clear out room where you need it for the other instruments that are happening there.
While we're talking about, I mean, obviously you just showed us something on guitars and before that on a mix bus, which answered two or three people's questions. Andrew has a question here, which I think is relevant right now while we're going through all of this, is Andrew wants to know, in your mind, has mixing in the box really become indistinguishable now from using the hardware that the plugins were based on in the first place?
Yeah, it's kind of a bugbear for me, actually. I think that it doesn't matter, first of all. Like, it doesn't matter if the plugins sound exactly like the hardware. If you don't have the hardware, you'll never know. And to say, are they as good as? Yes, they're absolutely as good as. Do they sound identical? Well, no, but no two hardware boxes sound identical, especially when you get into vintage gear. I mean, I own an RCA BA6A, which is a compressor. It's a mono limiter that weighs about 400 pounds, and it sounds great when you put it on stuff. And I tried to find a buddy for it for years, and I never found one that sounded anything like the one I already owned. And so there were two that I bought that I had to sell again. There were two that I got and didn't buy because they didn't sound right. So the idea that the plugins have to sound exactly like the gear is, I think that's the mistake. They definitely have the feel of the gear. They have that same sort of color. So if you know an 1176, you're not going to be disappointed with an 1176 plugin. It has all the same characteristics. The knobs are laid out the exact same way. But at the same time, 1176s only have 4 possible ratios plus different combinations of slamming the buttons in. And they're one of the most versatile compressors on the planet. And LA2A, all it has is a threshold control. That's it. So to be able to say, well, you know what? I think I want a colorful compressor, but I want all of the controls on it. And this is not just like touting Omnichannel. There are lots and lots of plugins that have the style of compressor that's the same as certain hardware pieces, but it gives you all of the control. Like here, if you're in FET, it's an 1176 is probably the closest thing to this. And if you go to infinity to 1, that's like pushing all the buttons in. But instead of only having infinity to 1 and then 20, 12, 8, and 4 to 1, you've got continuous control over your ratio. On 1176, you have continuous control over attack and release, but if you switch to opto mode, which would be like an LA2A, you still have continuous control over the ratio, which you had no control over, and control over the attack and the release. So you can get the style of compression, and those styles are very, very different. Opto, FET, and VCA being the sort of main 3. And then people talk about VaryMu, but technically that's just any compressor with a tube in it, because that's what VaryMu means. But you've got control over every single parameter within it. So in a lot of ways, the in-the-box processing is way more flexible, which can be intimidating when you're learning. It's nice to have something with just 2 knobs on it. But it can give you the characters. So yeah, I don't think that there's any reason that you would have to mix one way or the other.
While we're talking about plugins with only a couple of faders, I mean, you raised a point which is a good one, which is a lot of time people who are learning can dig themselves into a very deep hole that is only really got out of by undoing everything and starting again. How do you feel about plugins like Arvox and the Renaissance bundle? Because I mean, obviously Arvox sounds amazing on a bunch of different things, and it literally has like
There it is.
three faders, right?
Well, it's got three, and I've never used two of them. I mean, I just pull the compression down until it sounds good. No, I think they're great. But the only thing is, obviously, while you're learning, you really do need to understand what's probably going on under the hood. Because what if Arvox has worked on vocals for you for a year straight, every single thing you've mixed, and then all of a sudden you're mixing something and you put Arvox on, and it's like, oh, wow, that's not it. I don't like it on this. But you need to do something to the vocal, and you think it's probably compression. Now, all of a sudden, you have to jump off a cliff into the swimming pool. You have cliffs by your swimming pool. It's a terrible analogy. Anyway, now you've got to start going through all your other dynamics plugins and try and find a compressor that works, but you may not understand how compressors work. So I think it's really great to have the very simple ones that just get the job done, but you do also need to spend some time with ones that give you control. Like one of the things, I'm going to completely mess this mix up, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. That's why we've got this focus mode on here, because we realize there are a ton of knobs on this plugin. And that's not necessarily something that's easy to navigate while you're learning, or even when you're experienced, but it's the first time you're looking at this plugin. It just looks like an absolute mess. It's not a mess because it's really well done. And we've actually chosen slightly different knobs for each section for the major controls, because that's how clever we are. So there are a lot of thought went into the UI to try and make you be able to recognize it very quickly. So it's not a steep learning curve, but it is a ton of stuff on screen. But if you recall, one of my presets, let's recall something that's supposed to go on a mix. Did I do any mix presets? Oh, come on. I guess I didn't. Well, let's put the bass DI preset on. What you'll notice is there are three controls here that have a blue highlight. So what this is meant to do is I set lots of knobs all over this plugin and then said, if I were a 3-knob plugin, which 3 knobs would I be? I would be the threshold for the compressor. I would be the low boost for the EQ, not necessarily the frequency, because I'm on a shelf and I'm at, where am I at? 67. That's probably fine. Obviously, you know enough about EQ if you're running Pro Tools to know you can move that around, but that this boost is a big deal. And it's also highlighted because it's on. Like, I'm giving you extra low end there as well as the thumb. And then you've got this de-esser, which is going to be sucking out some nasty, probably just pick noise from a DI, because you generally will have some like contact noise, some mechanical noise. So this will help suck that out. So that's highlighted that way. And every preset that I've done has these focuses turned on. You can turn them off if you don't want to see them, but when you turn it on, it shows you what I felt was important. So it kind of makes it into a many fewer knob plugin until you decide you want to dive deep.
One of the things that somebody just mentioned, actually three people mentioned, was that they'd love to hear you talk a bit about how you deal with bass and processing and EQing and compressing bass in a mix like this.
Yeah, all right. I don't do much. It's weird. It's a question that gets asked a lot, and I don't do much. And I think I know why. But so the bass is spread out onto lots of different tracks. It makes sense because there's that little bit in the intro, and then there's another little breakdown later on. But generally, these basses are all kind of the bass part. So you can treat them as that. All I've got going on here is this is, again, from the Wayback Machine. This is before the omnichannel. So this here on the Helios plugin, when you switch in the 60 hertz EQ circuit, there's no boost whatsoever, but there's a boost because that's what Helios did. You switch the circuit in and there's some resonance inside the circuit. This is where the idea for the thump came from in the omnichannel. It's just some low end for you. It turns out it's a really broad EQ based around 100 hertz. Even though this says 60, it's based around 100. At 120, it's based around, I think, around 180, something like that. And then I would generally try and find a mid-range frequency that I would describe as honky, when you listen to it on its own. It's almost like if you swept a wah pedal, where would you get this kind of real throaty sound? Because that's where the tone is coming from, and you really hear the notes that are going on. So if we go to the hook bass, right, so it's a little bit of low end and a little boost. Now, if I were going to do that exact same thing on the Omni channel, then all I would do is the same thing. I would pop on the thump. Right, exactly the same thing. So that is how I would treat a bass instrument, period. Now, the other thing is, though, I always have a Pultec on my mix bus, always. And it is always boosting at 100. It's in my template. It comes up boosting at around 3. I don't know if that's 3 dB. Pultecs are weird. Maybe it's 3 dB. Maybe it's just 3 out of 10. Who knows? But I'm boosting at 100. Every once in a while, I'll dump that down to 60, but not often. So the low end is on the mix bus, not on individual instruments. So I'm shaping the individual instrument to have the low end I think the instrument should have, but how it works in the mix compared to the kick drum, which also has low end, is just taken care of in the mix bus itself. Now, remember, I'm sucking out that 118 hertz on the kick drum. That's leaving more room for the bass. And I think it's also important. You've got to think about what jobs are they doing. In this song, the bass is very driving, but there are a lot of stops, and he goes up a little bit higher sometimes. So that means the kick needs to be a very consistent bottom for the mix, and then the bass will be more of a melodic low end. But if it disappears, you don't feel like you've just lost all the weight in the mix. The kick drum can carry the mix even when the bass goes up high. So that's the very first thing, is to define the jobs that the instruments are going to do. And then past that, I don't know, because I don't compress my mixes anymore at all. So there's nothing going on that is compressing. Like I just did some widening with center and with an S1. Then there's that Pultec.
I love the S1.
It's awesome. I mean, it's been around forever, and it's just the shit. It's a great stereo widener, and all you got to do is just push up the width control. This is another one where you could just have one knob. I don't ever make it asymmetric or rotate it, and the gain, like whatever goes in comes out. That's fine.
I think one of the things about these older plugins that I always try and convey, and I think I've heard you do it as well, is sometimes I think people ignore the plugins that are perceived as old. Whereas this plugin, the S1, and things like the RVox and the Q10, yes, they've been around for like over 20 years, but they are the backbone of so many hit records still to this day, because they do a really, really good job at what they do.
Yeah. I mean, look, obviously, especially, modeling has come on. It didn't really exist then. It did a little bit, but that's obviously gone crazy. DSP coding has gotten better. People have gotten better at doing things. But at the same time, this was sort of like, early analog gear where, I got some components, and I think if I do a feedback loop here with a capacitor, I could build a filter, and okay, what sounds good? And that it was all based on just the sound. Like, hey, we want to do some stereo widening. What sounds good? Not which DSP algorithm should we choose based on blah, 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 blah. It was just Mayer saying, this sounds good. This is what we're going to do. And there's a lot of really genius stuff in the earlier plugins, I think.
So with the S1, while we're talking about widening, it's like a couple of people have asked, Michael has asked, good name, Michael, can you talk about when you would widen something with something like the S1?
Always. I mean, I have stereo widening on my mix bus all the time because I don't always use it. because what it can do is it can make something sound less natural. Now, on a song like this, that's good. You want this to sound like, whoa, what the hell is going on? If it just sounded natural, like a band in a rehearsal room, it wouldn't really be as exciting. That's why the drums are a little bit over the top and there's more room on them than they should necessarily have. And the guitars are EQ'd and super wide. So for this, the widening just helps tell the story. It helps it be like that. If you're mixing a more organic acoustic track, I would actually make sure you like it, because if it's in your template by default, it could be taking away a little bit of the intimacy. But compression can take away intimacy, EQ can take away intimacy. Anything that changes something from the way it would naturally sound in a room will take away intimacy, but at the same time, it can create a sense of excitement. So I am all for stereo widening, and I do it on individual tracks all the time. I love popping it on overheads. I'll pop it on keyboard pads just to spread stuff out so that you can still hear it, but it doesn't need to take up a lot of room.
Do you generally maybe EQ after that in some cases so that it doesn't kind of like take up too much, create too much extra body? Or how does that deal with decisions you make in the mix?
I mean, no, because the widening, I mean, I think this is a good representation of like the frequency response of the widening. It's widening much more as you go up. And that's fine. I wouldn't be widening low end necessarily. Though every once in a while, adding like a weird, stupid, short reverb to a bass to make it super wide can be amazing. Well, and listen to any Bowie record from the 70s. It's super stereo flanged bass or H3000 bass and stuff like that. So as a technique, you can use it on anything. But no, I don't ever push it to the point where now it's creating artifacts that I need to take care of, because that's boring to me. I don't want to have to do one thing and then do another thing.
Oh,
if I do the one thing and it goes too far, then I just back it off like it wasn't meant to be.
So we have a ton of questions here, so I'm gonna go through a few of them. Matsy says, Andrew, do you have any tips for managing the low end when you're dealing with someone who owns monitors that can't provide enough detail below 60 hertz, which obviously, I mean, there's a ton of different people in different situations out there. So how do you deal with something like that?
Well, I mean, obviously you can't deal with stuff you can't hear, but I think like but you can feel it. I mean, I do a lot of work in these headphones and I can feel when the sub's not right, because stuff's just out of control. And if you do have any dynamics processing, it's just going to be crushing the mix. Whereas if you pop a high pass filter just before that compressor and start going up to like 30 hertz or something like that, you'll realize like, oh, wow, everything's just cleaned up. Well, at that point, you don't need to know what was going on down below 30 because it was just screwing everything up. So just leave it gone. I think unless you're doing EDM or, I mean, I don't know what else really you need to worry about 15 to 20 hertz. Like it just doesn't matter. So I think what it is sometimes like on a kick drum, you'll try and get this huge low end, but you're in isolation. And when you pop it back into the track, it's probably sucking the whole mix down, because even if the only dynamics processing you have is a limiter, low frequencies have so much energy in them that you're just going to be hitting the wall really early. And you should realize that and just come up and start high passing the kick drum. I'm not high passing this one, but am I high passing it here? No, I didn't have to high pass, but I am sucking out that 94 hertz on the second kick drum mic to try and control it, because I can tell when I'm making that low end. Now, if you can't hear below 60, that's going to be a problem. Like you've got to have monitoring where you can hear below 60, but most decent headphones you can hear below 60. So I'd say if you're in doubt of what's going on below 30, shave it off. And if the mix all of a sudden just really tightens up, you might want to go check that out somewhere and prove to yourself that you're not missing anything.
Beautiful. All right, so Chris has a question. This is a good one, I think. He was wondering if you could talk about using EQ and compression as tools for tone rather than corrective tools. He's seen that sometimes you boost 500 in guitars and snare to give the mix a gritty sound like the Stooges, but he has found for himself that it's difficult to make that work in a mix, and can you help?
Well, actually, 500 hertz is not a frequency I would boost. 500 hertz is a frequency that almost always sounds bad. And if I remember rightly, I've screwed it all up now, but the omni-channel that was on the mix bus had a de-esser set at 500 hertz, and I was sucking some out. But like I was just showing on the bass, around 700 on bass is usually a really good spot to boost. So you can hear it's that really nasty sound. And if we go to the guitars, usually around 1.4, 1.5, something like that. Oh, that's different. Okay. Wow, I don't even have I'll put one on real quick. So you can see, I'll sweep the guitars the same way. Oh, wait, was that pre-chorus guitars? Oh, yeah. Forget that. Let's do rhythm guitars because that's easier.
Move it a bit over to the left, please.
Yeah. So if I sweep the rhythm guitars now. So you hear that spot around 1.4. That's a real nasty sound on its own, but it's where the tone is. So I'm going to switch that EQ in and out while they're playing. I forgot we're also in our MS mode. So switching EQ out is a little bit problematic, but let me just go ahead and set these up about the same-ish, and then I'll go back into stereo. Here's something that I think is actually really important about this. Forget about the EQ, like surgical EQ, like he said, forget about the EQ that's to fix stuff. Okay, if something's really wrong with something, you use EQ to fix it. That's fine. This sort of EQ, this lets me turn up the guitars, but I'm turning up only a certain part of them because that's the part that I want to hear. If I just turned up the guitars, the entire frequency range comes with it, and distorted guitars have a huge frequency range. Now I'm just going to be covering up everything. So I don't want that. I want that bitey tone, and then I've got a little bit of the thump in there because that sounds like cabinet thump and will actually help glue it to the bass. So here's with and without the thump. Right, so you can hear that really adds some low end to it. And I'm actually automating the thump out. So when we get to the breaks in the song, there are two little breakdowns where it goes to just the rhythm guitar. I wanted the guitars to be small again. So even though soloed up, they sound better with the thump, the point is to lift the mix up so then it can drop back down when everybody comes back in. If you go to just the guitars and the guitars still sound completely full frequency, then it's not that, whoa, what the hell just happened when everybody comes back in. So think about EQ like if you took a graphic EQ and put it down like it was faders. It's the way to turn stuff up. And I do this all the time. When I get a mix note from somebody that says, hey, could you turn up this? I don't turn it up. I EQ it. Because I only want to turn up the bit of it that's really easy to hear and is the defining characteristic of it, because that way I know I'm not messing with anything else. Like it was already meant to take up that space, and I'm just going to let it take up a little bit more space in that small range. So that's how I would think about the EQ. I think it's a really strong way to think about it, and it'll free you up because it also means you shouldn't be afraid of pushing 10 dB of some frequency because it's just like a big fader ride. And who's to say it had anything going on at that frequency anyway, right? So if it was deficient by 6 dB and you push it 10, you've only done +4. So don't worry about where the knobs are set. Just do what sounds good, but make sure so what I'm going to do, I'll take this EQ in and out with the stuff in the track, and you should hear a huge difference in how easy it is to hear what the rhythm guitars are playing. So that's a fader ride. I mean, it's 5 dB of EQ, but it feels like the entire guitar went down 5 dB because that's the window I have for you to listen to it, is that mid-range.
Well, Chris, you got your answer on that one. Okay, so we've got a question here from Matt who says, "What are some of your strategies when producing and mixing to create dash preserve the raw energy in a recording without overcooking or overworking it?"
Well, if at all possible, get early takes. Like always be recording. Make sure you're set up so that even if you're going to go tweak sounds, if you're cutting a live band, you get that first take because there's always something exciting while they're still figuring it out. And sometimes like somebody's headphone mix is crazy and it makes them play on top in a weird way because they can't see what's going on. They can't hear. So early takes are really important, at least to be able to reference to them. And then, yeah, just do exactly what you said not to do. Don't overcook it. It's why I no longer have a compressor on my mix bus. I mean, for years, I had a Neve style compressor on my mix bus, both hardware and then plugins. And it changes stuff. It makes it sound more like a record in a lot of ways, but it changes things. And I just got sick of the way that sounded. And so I feel like my mixes are starting to sound a bit more natural in a way. Like this is not necessarily a good example of it. When I pulled this up last week to prep it for this, I thought, I really want to process the drums. So I'm going to go for this kind of squishy thing. So I thought I would go ahead and do that. But in general, I like to have stuff sound natural. And the way to do that is to process the least amount. Spend more time on your balance and your panning and less time just going through every track and EQing and thinking that's going to help.
So Douglas says a question. No, go for it.
Okay. Well, no, there's just one other thing that I just wanted to mention this because it's a plugin that doesn't get a lot of love. And I think it's awesome. So really quickly, I want to show you something. So I'm going to put a J37 in on this mix bus. So let's say that I wanted to get some harmonic distortion and some tape squishiness on this mix, which it turns out I don't. But I'm going to put this in. This isn't the plugin I'm saying doesn't get the love. This gets lots of love because it's a great plugin. So here is this mix. I'll go to the solo, which is nice and loud, with and without this plugin. Okay, you can hear it's pushing mid-range. It's really making some sparkle happen way up top, and there's a little bit of sub happening. But I don't like the compression that's happening, the sort of tape compression. So what I wanted to show you really, really quickly, because people don't do this because you're not supposed to, but I don't really care what you're supposed to do, is I use Q-Clone to capture non-EQ plugins, because obviously tape machines have EQ built in. There's pre and post pre-emphasis. The tape does stuff. There's a head bump. So there's obviously lots of EQ going. And you'd say, well, yeah, but it's more of a dynamic thing and there's compression going on too. And it's like, yeah, I know. I don't want the compression. I only want the EQ curve. So if you don't know Q-Clone, basically it transmits a tone and receives its own tone. So you've got to set it up on something that looks like it's just nothing but feedback. So this is an aux track that's going out to bus 63 and back in bus 63. So this is feedback central. If I take this plugin out, it just squeals because it's feedback. And then I've got the J37 with the exact same settings, or are they the same? I don't even know. So I'm going to copy the settings and I'm going to come down to this J37 and I'm going to paste them. Okay, it was different. And now this is actually running the EQ curve of that plugin. And then down here, I've got the Q-Clone, regular Q-Clone. And you can say capture, that's the EQ curve of the J37, the way it's being set up right now. And you can see it change if I open this up. And I change tape speed, totally different, right? Change tape formulation.
Q-Clone's behind your head right now, by the way.
Oh, sorry, man. So here's, yeah, you got to see this because it's cool. So if I change tape formulation, a totally different EQ curve. Right?
Yeah.
Speed. So I don't even remember what it was on. Let's say it was on 815. And I like the sparkle I'm getting, but it's turning the cymbals backwards and it's doing all that stuff that compression might not be good for. I say capture, and now I can just say hold. I can get rid of this guy. And now I can open up this Q-Clone. And I can open up this guy and I can save it as a preset. And so I'll put into the preset menu as, and we'll just call this waves. And now in any QClone plugin, I can load waves. And now I have that EQ. So it's all of that high-end grain and all of the low-end bump right here. So it's almost like a low-end shift. It's sucking out some low mids and adding some bottom end, but it does it without any of the compression artifacts. And it's genius because everybody's like, oh, tape, it's the magic thing. It can also destroy things. But when you get rid of the plugin altogether, like, oh, right, there was some stuff in there that was actually kind of cool. This is a way you can actually suck the EQ curve out of Dynamics plugins. And it's awesome. And it works for hardware too. So QClone doesn't get enough juice.
No, it really doesn't. And by the way, Fritz, if you're still here, Fritz, we just answered your question as well, which is about saturation and distortion and things. QClone is one of those plugins that I think you're right, Andrew. It's like so many of these really, really classic plugins that created this company sometimes get lost in the fray of the newer ones that have been released.
Well, and another thing, just really quickly, the reason QClone was developed was for people who had like a couple of pieces of gear. If you own one Neve EQ or one API EQ, but you want to use it on 10 different tracks and you want to do a hybrid thing, you can set it up exactly how you want it on the guitar, then capture it with QClone, take it off the guitar and patch your one API EQ into the next guitar track, EQ it how you want it, capture it. And it does a really, really good job of doing that.
It does. Okay, so
moving on.
Next question. What's your cat's names?
Oh, have they've been coming and going? The black one is named Mole, and the tabby guy is named Squid, and they're pretty dumb, but they're great.
They're dumb. Yeah. Okay, so Tony says, "Hello, Andrew. When do you think a mix cannot be made any better? Lean your chair back, put your hands behind your head, and declare that the mix is finished."
I never think a mix can't be made better. And I know for a fact a mix can always be made different. But basically, there's like a checklist in my head when I start a mix, and it's nothing to do with sonics. It's to do with how it feels. And I'll know, like, with this song, when I was working on the drums last week, I knew I want him to feel processed and big. Like almost not 90s, but, you know, just a bigger sound, a slightly less natural thing. So the mix isn't done until the drums do that. I knew when we got to those little breakdowns with the guitars that I didn't want the guitars too big. So that was a mixing thing. Like, I'll play you one of the spots. So you've got that double entrance. The rest of the guitars come in and then the drums come in. So that has to work really well. So there's a checklist of that stuff, but basically I mix it until nothing bothers me and then I send it to the client. And I know it's not done when I send it the first time. I mean, it's always a collaborative process to finish the mix, but I shouldn't be handing it off with anything that I would make an excuse for. So like the mechanism for when I know I'm ready to send a mix is you make mix notes on your own mix, you put them in the email like you're going to tell the person you're sending it to what's not right yet, and then you fix all of those things until your email just says, hey, here's a mix.
Right. Paul asks, could you explain your session management when you use folders as opposed to groups, VCAs as opposed to auxiliaries, and funneling down to the buses?
Yeah, I use all of everything all the time. So folders are awesome, and I am a huge proponent of them. This session doesn't have as many folders as it would if I were mixing it from scratch, but I was opening up an old mix and just messing with it. So folders, I use routing folders for things like the drum kit, but not everything in this folder is necessarily going through it. It turns out every track in this folder is going through the bus that's being controlled by the folder. That's not necessarily the case in Pro Tools. And at first that might seem a little confusing, but it's actually really cool. I could put my parallel drum compression inside the drum folder if I wanted to just clean up the session. I mean, I'll do it right now. I can take all of this stuff and chuck it inside the folder. And even though it goes straight off to the mix bus, because otherwise I'd get feedback because I'm sending to it from individual tracks that are within the folder and the folder itself for the drum room. But now I can collapse this and all my drum stuff just goes away. So I use folders for on-screen organization as well as the audio path. I would never use an aux to collect the audio from audio tracks anymore. I would always use a folder. So inside the kit folder, you notice there's a room folder. So I wanted to process the room mics together. So the quickest way to do it is just pop them into a room folder. Now the room folder feeds the kit bus, but I can also just fold this up if I want. So folders for everything. And then I have a VCA for every group of instruments. So the drums, bass, all the guitars, there's always a VCA because I can very, very quickly, while I'm mixing, just completely rebalance the mix, but I know that all my internal balances between all of those guitar parts is preserved. Right. And I can do the same thing with the vocals. So I've got a VCA for every group of stuff, and it's always yellow. And every audio track is a member of the group being controlled. Never auxes, never folders, nothing. Because when I mute this, I need to make sure that all the audio is actually muted. If I've got sends on individual audio tracks, but this VCA was just controlling a folder that those tracks were sending to, when I muted the VCA, it wouldn't mute the tracks and those sends would still be active. So I make sure that it's all the audio tracks are in groups that are assigned to the VCA, and then the tracks themselves go inside a folder. The folder can almost replace the VCA, but not yet, because I like the routing folders. But unless you route all of the tracks through the folder, that volume control doesn't control them. So I still like having separate VCAs. And then I'm just meticulous about laying stuff out. My track order is always exactly the same. Kick is always first unless there's something like intro drums. If this happened later in the song, I would actually have it further down. If this were breakdown drums, it would go below the kit. But because it happened first, I put it above the kit. Then kick, snare. This doesn't have the same normal track layout because they were cut separately with the cymbals. But the drum tracks are always the same. Then percussion, then programming, then percussion, then bass, then guitars, then keys, then lead vocal, then background vocal. And again, you got folders for the vocals and VCAs as well. And then those guys all go straight to the mix bus. I don't have what a lot of people have, which are essentially stem auxes. So like all my drums happen to be going through an aux right now, but their parallel compressors are going straight to the mix bus along with the aux that collects the drum kit. So I don't have a drums aux. The reason for that is because there's so much shared parallel compression that goes across groups of instruments. It's not like I could just print auxes like that and have it add up to the mix, because it's just not the way my mixes are structured.
While we're talking about how your mixes are structured, I think this is a good point to especially for the people who are just starting out. One of the things I know about you is, and you breezed across it for a second there, is every time you get in a session from anybody, from an artist or a label, you automatically take it out of its existing order and label and you put it into your template so everything is exactly where you want it. So that that way, as I like to put it, the DAW is working for you, you're not working for it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, this session is, again, it's one that I prepped for NAMM, I think 6 years ago, maybe 7. And I opened it up last week and I had absolutely no problem finding anything in the session. Some of the stuff isn't the way I do it anymore. There were things that were different because I've changed my template. It changes every month. I do a save as. But the drum tracks were at the top in the right order and the same color that my drum tracks have been since I've started using Pro Tools, and they had colors, which they didn't used to have. So to be able to assign the color meant that I chose the color for my drums, and that's been the same for 15 years. And the same for everything else. Guitars are always green. Keyboards are always some sort of red, purple, pink kind of thing. Lead vocals are always orange. Background vocals are always this sort of next, it's just on the palette next to the orange. But that way I can open a session from anywhere in my career and be able to reverse engineer it very, very quickly because this stuff just doesn't change.
And especially as we go forward, that it happens more and more that over the years you'll have to open this up one day and know where everything is and be able to do a new mix on it or change something on it. So having the same system works.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I get calls to print. Oh, hey, can we get an instrumental of that song you mixed 11 years ago because someone might use it in an advertisement, and we didn't want an instrumental back then. And I need to be able to open it up and figure out what the hell's going on. And if that takes me time, it takes me away from drinking beer, and I'm not interested in that.
Okay, so now I have a couple of questions that some people may have asked, and if you did ask it, I apologize if I missed it. Before we close out, I just wanted to know, it's like, obviously a lot of people right now are working in headphones, and
Yeah.
Having said that, they're working in headphones, but also a lot of people are now more listening to music on a medium through the headphones that they just got with their phone, and that's part of everyday life. So how do you try and work in a current scenario and make your stuff sound good if you're just working in headphones? I mean, I know you said you work in headphones, but you also have monitors. Is it possible? Is it possible for people to kind of like really get a good mix in a pair of headphones these days?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I say I do a lot of work in headphones, I do 90-something% of my work in headphones because I've gotten so used to it. I check my stuff on the speakers just because I can, because now they're in the same room where I am. But I've mixed stuff on the road. Like I did a month in Australia doing seminars, and I got a call to mix a track for Hosier. And I wasn't going to say no. And I was doing lectures, but I wasn't going to be in a studio. And I just mixed it in headphones in the hotel because what else was I going to do? So the point is to know your monitoring. And headphones are monitoring the same way speakers are. There is not something magic about speakers that can't possibly exist on headphones. Obviously, they can't be as loud, but you can damage your hearing no problem in headphones. So that's loud enough. People say you can't hear low end, but that's not true. You absolutely can, especially when you've got contact with your head. And that's the best low end you can get, is actually resonant low end if it's true. There is also, if you want it, there are great things like NX in the Studio 3 plugin. There are third-party things that will do EQ corrections. And there's EQ curves built into some of the wave stuff as well to say, hey, look, I'm using these headphones. Like, I know that these Sonys have a hole at around 400 and they boost the top. I could correct for that, but I've gotten so used to it that I just leave it. The point is, with headphones, you've done away with all of the problems of acoustics, period. It's really hard to be in a room that make your headphones sound bad, right? Like, that's difficult. It's very easy to be in a room that make your speakers sound bad. Very, very easy. Plus, instead of having a little bit of voltage pushing a different impedance for depending on the headphones, but generally headphones are kind of low impedance and they get pretty loud pretty easily. You have to drive a lot of power. You have to have good power amps if they're not powered speakers. You've got to have a really good monitor pot. Nothing will destroy your mix more than a bad D to A going through a bad monitor pot. Then what are you listening to? Whereas with a headphone amp, it's not as mission critical. There are a lot more like decent headphone amps than there are decent amplifiers. So it gets rid of a lot of that guesswork. But the big thing is, do a mix on headphones, then go listen to it somewhere that you trust. Whether it could be your car, it could be your buddy's speakers when you're allowed to go to their house, which who knows when that's going to be. But whatever it is, if you hear problems, don't fix them while you're listening to the other thing. Go back to your headphones and see if you can hear the problem. If you can't, but you're sure that it is a problem, because let's say you checked it on 3 other things and it was all that same mess in the low mids, but you just cannot hear the problem on your headphones, you got to get a different pair of headphones. They're just the wrong headphones. But that's the same with speakers. If you mix on a pair of speakers, but every time you send a mix out, they're like, wow, what's going on in the low mids? That means you've got a monitoring problem, and that can happen on headphones or speakers. So it's about knowing the playback system and trusting it. And the one plus about the headphones is, first of all, they're generally a little bit cheaper. And second of all, you're wearing your studio on your head. It doesn't change when you go somewhere. So it's a bit of a myth that you can't do a mix on headphones. You absolutely can. It's not necessarily the easiest thing, and it takes time to get used to, but you can.
Yeah, it's like getting used to the sound of any pair of monitors, whether they're Genelex or KRKs. It's headphones is the same
Yeah.
thing. On that note, just quickly, it's like you mentioned loudness and getting pretty loud and damaging your hearing in headphones. How do you feel about what level people can really get the best idea of their frequencies in the mix? Do you mix low sometimes and then go back to a normal level, or do you mix loud all the time?
Yeah, I mean, for years, I only ever mixed, and this is speakers or headphones, really loud or really quiet. And lately, like in the last couple of weeks, I've forced myself to start listening at kind of medium volumes. Listening at a kind of not loud, but sort of regular volume is actually really boring for me. Like, I don't like it because it's loud enough that your brain is actually trying to shut some stuff down. Like, you can't concentrate as well as when you listen really quietly. When you listen really quietly, it's ridiculously easy to hear pitch, to hear timing, to hear balance, all that kind of stuff. As soon as you start turning it up, your brain gets busy trying to protect itself, and it's more scattered. It's harder to listen to just one element of things. But then really loud, you get the impact, and it's exciting and it's fun. But I am finding that if you only do those two levels, there are things that can get past you, like messiness in the low mids, because you won't hear that at all when it's quiet. And when it's really loud, you could mistake that for power, when it turns out it's actually a bit of a mess. So you do need to listen at a normal level sometimes, but I think it's whatever works for you. The only thing you can't afford to do is to listen really loud all the time, because you'll just blow yourself out. And the reality is that your brain is spending so much energy shutting your ears down, you can't actually hear when
Yeah,
stuff's really loud.
everything sounds good loud. It's nearly like our brain has a compressor, I think, at some point. So
Oh, it does. It physically does. It hardens your inner ear. That's why if you're at a concert and it's really loud and then you put your fingers in your ear, the pitch seems to go up. It's because your brain has relaxed the physical compressor in your inner ear. The body is badass. There's a physical compressor in your ear it dampens your inner ear to keep the hairs from getting damaged.
there's actually a really good book by a guy called Daniel Levitin I think it's called Your Brain on Music, or Your Brain
Yeah.
and Music. And it drove me crazy how smart that man was, and some of the things he talked about the brain and music. So, okay, moving on. Before we close out, if there was one piece of advice you would want to share with people who want to be at the level that you're at outside plugins, just about life and career, what do you think it would be?
I think really it's a really complicated one to answer, and there are a lot of different ways I can go, but I'm going to go this way, which maybe isn't the most productive thing, but I think it's sort of important. I see people, posting on the internet all the time about how, like, there was somebody talking about how Serban Gaina, who's an amazing mixer. I mean, holy shit, is he a good mixer? And someone was saying there's no way he mixes in the box, because there's no way you could get a mix like that without hardware. So first of all, that's counterproductive, because he's been mixing in the box before anybody. That dude was mixing in the box when it was 888s and mix cards. And he still made everything sound better than everybody else. He's just better. So the first thing is to realize that there is some talent involved. It isn't just about collecting the gear or the plugins or the DAW or the whatever. Like, I've seen people ask, like, what's the best DAW to use for metal? And like, well, it's whichever one you know really, really well, so that while you're working on the music, you can do everything you want to do, as opposed to fumbling or just saying, well, I don't know how to do that in Reaper, so I'm not going to bother doing that. Like, that's the best DAW to use for everything. And the best tools to use are the ones where you're hearing something and you go, man, that's not right. I need it to be like this. And you say, oh, this is the tool that gets me there. It doesn't matter what those tools are. So what I would say, as you're learning, to make this advice and not just a rant, is to Pick a small tool set and learn the shit out of it. Learn absolutely everything about the DAW that you work in and every single plugin that you use. Practice. Just practice stuff. You don't need, there's stems all over the internet. If you want stuff to mix, get stuff to mix and just practice mixing. And that's it. And that's how you get better. It's just doing it. And it's not because there's some magic thing that happens after 10,000 hours, like Malcolm Gladwell says. But what there is there's this slow process of transforming the which knob do I turn question into the how do I make this feel the way I want it? And that might be EQ, but you're never going to say EQ is the thing that makes stuff feel sad. But on that mix, it might be. Or an opto compressor might be the thing that makes it feel sad, or a certain kind of reverb, or a flanger, or some subharmonic synthesis. Like, who the hell knows what's going to make it sound sad? But the deal is you want it to be sad, and you've got a toolbox that you know so well that you can reach inside of it and try and find the sad button for that mix. That's what's really, really important and what you should be working towards.
Well, there you have it. So, Andrew,
you have something.
Oh, we definitely got something. Andrew Scheps, thank you so much for your time. I know everybody.
Thank you, Michael.
No, man. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And Andrew, I'll be right back with you straight after I've closed out. So, that, my friends, was a Waves Open session with Andrew Scheps. There's a ton of stuff in there for you. So whether you are locked in quarantine at home or whether you have been allowed out in your part of the world yet, but you're still mixing in the box or wherever you are with any creativity you have, please be safe. Remember that we're here to help you. Our tech support is open. The sales is open. The website is there. The chats are there. We're all in this together, and I really, really do hope that you come and watch the next Waves Open session. MPA out.